holding this briefing. Let me start with the energy ministerial last Saturday in Goa, because I think that really gives us an important temperature check on how the geopolitics of the clean energy transition are playing out. To give some credit to the ministers, there was progress on a few issues. For the first time, we saw the G20 agree on the need to double the global rate of energy efficiency improvement by 2030. And even though this is voluntary, it's a step towards a global energy efficiency target at COP28, which is one of the goals that the incoming UAE presidency has set. Ministers also called for stepping up deployment of distributed renewable energy technologies, and they recognize the need to increase basic energy access for the hundreds of millions of people that don't have access to modern energy services, and to provide low-cost finance for the clean energy transition in developing countries. And of course, this is one of the huge stumbling blocks to getting the progress we need towards decarbonization, is that finance is at much higher rates in many developing countries than it is in developed countries, which makes it hard for clean renewable energy projects to pencil out. The ministers also recognize the importance of critical minerals and the need to address challenges, including reducing the negative impacts of mining, building diversified supply chains, maintaining open and reliable trade, and promoting recycling and sustainable alternatives wherever possible. But there were two big stumbling blocks which the Indian presidency were unable to overcome despite their best efforts, and these are reflected in the chair's summary portion of the text that was issued after the meeting. First is the need to set a clear and unambiguous global goal of at least tripling renewable energy capacity to 11 terawatts by 2030, accompanied by implementation strategies. And if you look at the chair's summary, it only notes that accelerated deployment of zero and low emission technologies, including renewables, plays an important role in achieving energy transitions, and says there is a need to scale up the deployment of renewable energy at an accelerated pace. Doesn't set any particular target, doesn't talk about what's needed to achieve that, and also calls for similar ambition with respect to other zero and near zero technologies, including carbon abatement and removal technologies, sort of blurring or watering down the focus on clean renewables. We hear from people in the room that the countries most strongly opposing clear renewable energy language included Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, South Africa, and Indonesia. So that's a critical mass of countries. It's very difficult for a presidency to overcome opposition from such a large group. The ministers also failed to acknowledge the necessity of phasing down production and use of fossil fuels, which, as we all know, is the main driver of the climate impacts that are ravaging the planet as we speak, with new temperature records being set on almost a daily basis and other climate impacts accelerating. Ministers didn't even reiterate the recognition at their summit in Bali last year of the need to accelerate the phase down of unabated coal generation. Instead, if you look at the chair's summary, there was a clear split in the room. It reads that the importance of making efforts towards phase down of unabated fossil fuels in line with different national circumstances was emphasized by some members, while others had different views on the matter, that abatement and removal technologies will address such concerns. And I think from an environmental standpoint, the concern is that this really gives undue importance to unproven abatement technologies that are not ready for deployment at scale and at a reasonable cost, and creates an opening for continued fossil fuel use. If you look at carbon capture and storage, for example, the Carbon Capture Institute reports that currently we're seeing about 44 megatons of carbon being sequestered annually. from projects now in operation. That increases to around 250 megatons if you include projects that have been announced or planned but are not yet online. By contrast, we need about 15 gigatons of reductions in carbon emissions from the energy and industrial sectors needed by 2030 to keep 1.5C alive. So clearly there may be different views on the relative importance of CCS in the long term. Some believe it will be needed to address emissions in hard to abate sectors, but clearly it is not a near-term solution to the problem. And in terms of meeting the need to reduce emissions 43% by 2030, as the IPCC outlines, it is not going to be a significant contributor. So that's a problem. From what we heard out of GOA, the main fight against the inclusion of a fossil fuel phase down goal was led by Saudi Arabia. But there are also reports that several other countries opposed the inclusion of such a goal, even as a voluntary measure with no timeline. So that's a big concern. Also, it's important to note that the text frames energy security and energy transition as parallel goals with trade-offs between the two, which is really a retro view of energy security, rather than emphasizing the role of accelerating the clean energy transition in improving energy security and affordability, as the G7 energy ministers did when they met in April in Japan. Now, of course, as you said, the climate and energy ministers will be meeting tomorrow in Chennai, and all indications out of the working group discussions that are making final preparations for that meeting is that they will fail to agree on more ambitious climate actions. There are signals that the Saudis and China in particular are taking an especially hard line on acknowledging the IPCC's clear conclusion that meeting the 1.5C temperature goal requires deep and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and the need to peak global emissions by 2025. And we're hearing that just as happened last week in Goa, Saudi Arabia is blocking language on unabated fossil fuel phase out by mid-century. So assuming this plays out as indications are that it will over the next day or so, there's some real questions I think this raises. First, on the Leaders Summit of the G20 in September, I think there's a question whether Prime Minister Modi can work with fellow leaders to rise above the divisions that have been on display in these two ministerial meetings and salvage some level of greater ambition on climate and the clean energy transition. There's also a question of whether he can work with President Macron and other leaders to provide signals of a more significant financial offer for developing country decarbonization. Clearly, the lack of adequate signals, particularly from the G7 countries, but others as well, that resources will be available to finance the transition has been a major challenge and has eroded trust. But this also, I think, raises questions for the incoming UAE COP28 presidency. It's clear, for example, that the Saudi negotiators have been doing their best to undermine the goals on renewable energy scale up and a just fossil fuel phase down that were laid out by the incoming COP president, Sultan Al Jaber, just a couple of weeks ago. So I think there's a real issue here of a open split between Riyadh and the UAE, which is going to pose challenges. And of course, as I said earlier, it's not just the Saudis. There are other countries that are coming in on some of these issues as well. So this is going to be something that Sultan Al Jaber and his team will have to work on hard over the next few months if they're going to get a better outcome in Dubai than we saw in Goa and are likely to see in Chennai. And I would also say that the negotiating position of China is also a challenge here. This may be related to some of the dynamics between the US and China, with the US-China working group just restarting It may result from China's concern about energy security and avoiding any pressure to accelerate the phase down of domestic coal use. We really don't understand it. But on renewables, it's especially puzzling because China is clearly the world's largest producer and consumer of renewable energy. And it would seem to be that there would be tremendous market opportunities for China if there were a commitment to try to triple renewable energy use by 2030. So this is a bit of a mystery that I think we need to suss out. And I think also, as I mentioned, the lack of progress out of the G20 to date at the ministerial level on unlocking the financial support that is needed to dramatically accelerate markets for clean energy is a challenge. Now, to be fair to the energy ministers and the climate and environment ministers who are meeting tomorrow, finance is not their brief. It's the finance ministers and especially the leaders that are going to need to step up and address this. And we know that the UAE understands this, and they are having informal conversations with countries about ways to accelerate mobilization of financial resources. But there's some real storm clouds on the horizon, I think you can say, out of these two ministerials. The G20 represent over 80% of the global economy and of global emissions. If you can't get consensus on key issues out of the G20, it's hard to see how you will get them out of 190 plus countries a few months from now in Dubai. So some real issues to address here. It's not over. Obviously, the G20 Leaders Summit offers an opportunity to salvage something out of this process, but it's pretty troubling